Perspective now from retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton, a former member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a CNN military analyst, and Rolf Mowatt-Larssen, a former CIA intelligence officer. Colonel Leighton, you saw Melissa's report there. Ukrainian forces running guerrilla warfare type drills, getting prepared if Russia does attack. What do you think an invasion could look like in your view?
Well, John, good evening. I think it would be a mess. It would be a horrible situation. That one person that was interviewed by Melissa kind of hit it on the head, that nobody would win in the end, a war like this. So what you would see is, instead of a full-on invasion, I think it may be more likely that we have a kind of hybrid warfare that would go into effect here. So if this were to happen, then what you'd see is an increase in cyber attacks. You would see an increase in special warfare activities that would include targeted assassinations, coupled with actual attacks from the forces that are arrayed around Ukraine right now. So it would be a combination of all of those things, and that would then serve to move forward the Russians' interests and potentially allow them to take Kiev very quickly.
Rolf, looking at some of the intelligence that U.S. officials say they have on Russia, they say 70% of their military capabilities are in place for a full-scale invasion. What does that tell you just in terms of the amount of resources that Russia has put in place there?
Well, John, I think you have to start with what is the risk of that invasion from the standpoint of using military force to achieve Putin's objectives. That will be the trigger point on what he decides to do, and if he deploys all those forces into Ukraine, particularly from Belarus, which you have to assume the objective would be to take Kiev. So there are three big problems Putin has to resolve in order, I think, to make that decision. One would be, how does he turn a government in Kiev more like the governments in Belarus and Kazakhstan, from his perspective, friendly governments? That's not as easy as it sounds, even if he does a lightning strike and takes over Kiev. The second problem he has, if this results, as many analysts have said, in massive casualties on both sides, what do the Russian people think of that when body bags start coming home, not to mention the Ukrainian people and the tragedy of war that right now is not being addressed until people actually start dying? That could actually undermine Putin more than any success he has. And the third point is, if Putin goes in, what happens afterwards? It's one thing to take Kiev and possibly even change the government. But does he plan to fight an insurgency? Does he want to leave? He doesn't have a force large enough to occupy the entirety of Ukraine. So this has been a Russian problem since 2004, when Russian intelligence attempted to assassinate Viktor Yushchenko, the presidential candidate, and who became ultimately the president of Ukraine. And they've been trying for 17 years to make Ukraine a puppet state of Russia, and they haven't succeeded. So I think Putin understands this to some extent, but he's listening to the advice of very hardcore former KGB officers in Russia who will not stop until Ukraine is back to being part of Russia from their perspective.
Look, there's a reason this region is called the Bloodlands. Colonel Leighton, President Biden says Russia can still de-escalate here, but is that in Vladimir Putin's nature?
Not normally, John. Very few times has he really de-escalated. Every time that he's done something, he has grabbed territory or made a huge imprint on the target country. Probably the mildest attack that he ever did was in 2007 against Estonia, and that was only a cyber attack. But when he went after Georgia, the country of Georgia, and went after Ukraine, of course, in 2014 with the Donbass and with Crimea, that showed his true colors, and it's not in his nature to withdraw, to lose face, or to do anything that would show him to be weak.
So, Rolf, CNN has some really interesting reporting today that, according to communications intercepted by U.S. intelligence, some Russian officials may have doubts about the success of a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. What do you think that means?
Well, John, I think it means there are rational people in Russia. From a military perspective, this is by no means an easy endeavor, particularly if they go on a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And in addition to the casualties the Russian military will take and the uncertainty of success, they've been deployed out there now for weeks and, in fact, months in many cases. I was an Army captain in Germany in the mid-'70s, and it's very difficult they're literally out in the cold, and especially if Vladimir Putin hasn't decided yet on what he wants to do. That's very difficult on military commanders. It's very difficult on soldiers. And I'm not surprised there are opposition voices in Russia, at least voices that I've heard, in fact, even some generals have expressed some reservations that this is a good idea. So hopefully there is still time to talk Putin out of it, whether it comes from the negotiating process by the Europeans and the United States or from internally in Russia.
Got about 30 seconds left, Colonel. Emmanuel Macron, helping or hurting in his 5-hour discussion with Putin today?
Well, John, he's trying to help, but of course there's always a risk that he's going to increase the fissures that Putin could exploit. So far, I'd say he's helping, but there's a great danger that it could actually hurt NATO's interests at this point.
All right, Colonel Cedric Leighton, Rolf, thank you both very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
We have some breaking pandemic news.